Alrighty, welcome back to more SOVL PvP with a little bit of PvE as well, because we're continuing our romp today through each of the DLC factions. Just a reminder, for each one we're looking at the overall vibes, what makes them unique, some notable units, strengths, weaknesses, how to play against them, some example PvP lists, and we're going to be answering that all important question: why should you play this faction? Alright, so in the first one last week we looked at the Goatman Raiders, and today we're just going to be ramping up that chaotic aggression with the yes, the most metal of all the factions are the Abyssal Legion from the Into the Abyss DLC. In Warhammer terms, these guys exemplify everything chaos. You have your Chaos Warriors in the Abyssal Warriors and Knights. You got your Slaves to Darkness, or like the Marauder units in the various Northmen units, and of course a slew of demons to boot. In terms of visual influences and sort of vibes, you need to look no further than the work of legendary artist Frank Frazetta, whose fantasy characters were that real blend of the sort of Norse barbarian vibe with the gothic Black Knight. In SOVL, this ruthless, chaotic vibe is really reflected in one of the most aggressive factions in the game, with no ranged units to speak of. They are a pure melee army that needs to get up into their opponent's face to do some damage. The units tend to come in one of two flavors: either the cheap, aggressive Northmen and the dogs, things like that, or the super expensive but super elite warriors and demons. For the Trail of Death campaign, they get the same demonic gifts as the Goatman, where the unit gets +1 to a random stat, which, as you can imagine, can be very hit or miss. For notable units, the Abyssal Champion is one of the strongest commanders in the game. Give him True Strike, stick him on a Manticore, and he makes for one of the best assassin-style characters that can just dive in and take out your opponent's commander. That is because of his unique ability, the Demonic Possession. It's a once per game activation that gives him 3 additional attacks at the expense of -3 to his skill. So 6 or even 7 attacks if you're rocking the 2-hand weapons. It's often enough to just shred most characters in one turn of combat. For the Crackback, he's also dripped out in Abyssal Armor, which a few of the units in this army have, and it gives them +1 to damage saves. Now this works the same as the Masterwork armor in Dwarves, where actually it's not quite the same as +1 defense. Instead, the save roll is determined based on the power and defense first, and then this +1 is applied, so it's even slightly better. Another unit that benefits actually from this Abyssal armor is the Chariot, where it makes it just that bit more resilient to getting shot off. And it then helps it as well stick around in combat after that initial crushing charge. Similar to the Goatman that we talked about, the Hounds with their high mobility and punch for a very low cost are a staple in most Abyssal Legion lists. And at a base cost of 175 points, the Abyssal Knights are the single most expensive unit in the game, but also the most elite, with good damage output, mobility, excellent survivability. Their only downside is that almost prohibitively high cost. As mentioned, for strengths, they have one of the choppiest commanders in the game and a lot of fast, cheap units, so they can really play that go wide aggro strategy well. And if you can use them well, they have some of the strongest individual units in the game. Also, this may or may not be a strength depending on the kind of player you are, but they have a lot of units that just really don't see that much play. So if you're the kind of player who likes to experiment and cook and go with something off meta, maybe this army's for you. However, there's a good reason that you don't see them. Many of their more expensive units are pretty overcosted right now, especially since having fewer units than your opponent gives you an inherent disadvantage in a game where setting up flanks, flees and counter charges are all so important. In addition, zero ranged options to speak of means your opponent really doesn't even have to worry about an entire phase of the game. When you're playing against Abyssal, I almost always expect to see some combination of cheap units, so protecting those flanks, like we talked about last week, is even more relevant. You know that they're going to have to get into combat with you to deal damage, so fleeing is actually especially good against them. Just be careful of those angles. Try not to flee into the path of another one of their cheap units, things like that. You can also expect that a champion on a Manticore is going to be in the list and is going to want to target your commander. So especially if you're running a commander whose spells and abilities are a core part of your strategy, you might want to be, doubly careful in hiding them as best as possible. And also if you're matched up against them, minor thing, but you can deploy with impunity, without setting up screens, safe in the knowledge that nothing's going to shoot at your most precious units. Moving on to PvP lists. Let's start with, it's probably the most archetypal Abyssal list. That's this sort of go wide aggro sort of strategy with the champion on a Manticore at the head. As we've mentioned before, the chariots are a really nice piece, and then 2 units of hounds at 50 points each really helps with that swarming playstyle. So then it's just really, what do you do with the remaining points? I think this particular iteration is nice because it just maximizes the number of units. We're getting 7 units in here with the 3 units of Northmen with hand weapon and shield. That leaves 20 points left. And I really do think the champion benefits from additional weapon and item enhancements, enchantments rather. But with just 20 points, you can either kill them out like this with 2 hand weapons and prowess. That's going to maximize that damage output from that 1 demonic possession turn, giving you an extra attack. Even with the -3 skill, you're going to be still hitting on +3s, I think, against a lot of the mages in the game. That's skill 3. Alternatively, you can get them out for some more protracted fights with something like, a great weapon and vitality for a little bit more staying power. Now, in terms of the optimal champion build, I still think it is something like the Homelander, True Strike and Unnatural Power. Makes a really choppy combination with the great weapon. Additionally, for I think 5 points cheaper, you can instead go with Cruelty and Prowess, something like that. In both cases, it would require you to probably drop one of these units of Northmen. Then you can either bump up the numbers in the others. You could go for some 2 hand weapons, put the points in there, or even swap out one of the units of hounds for some Northman horsemen, which have 1 less power, but a little bit more staying power with 1 more defense and crucially an additional wound each. All right, looking at something a bit different, the area I think I've seen the most success with the sort of Abyssal Knights or any of these really expensive units is using them as a retinue, and actually paired with the sorcerer instead of the champion. This unit, even just with hand weapons, is choppy enough. And the sorcerer with Hex of Ruin just helps the damage output from some of your other units. Trying out Shroud here, it's almost like a Banner of Mist, but it's actually 5 points cheaper, and you can actually move it around as well if this unit doesn't need it and your hounds do, something like that. One downside is it requires you then to activate this unit early on in the phase, which you don't always have to do, so it's not exactly optimal there. In terms of the rest of the list, usual couple of units of hounds, chariot, and then putting any additional points we have into just bumping up this unit of Northman axes. You really want that to probably just hold an objective while everything else is doing the damage. As I said, had some success with this. I think it's a really nice list. It's leaning on that sort of Death Star style where you look at the amount of points pumped into this 1 unit and has all the weaknesses of other Death Star lists like Vampire with Dread Knights, really expensive unit where, yeah, it's really choppy, you can get the job done, but is a little bit vulnerable if your opponent can manage to take this one unit out. Alternatively, I have a video out, go check this out, on this I'm calling Team Double Devil, featuring both the champion on a Manticore and the Archdevil, which is a really cool unit. Unfortunately, it's a whopping 150 points. Most cases probably not worth it. I think it compares pretty unfavorably even to, this is what, naked champion, no, enchantments, and even so I don't think it compares with that favorably, and it's a little bit more expensive as well. However, it's a very fun unit, and not only that, every other faction in the game at 500 points can only field maximum of one kind of choppy mounted unit, and the Archdevil really kind of plays at like one of those champions on a Manticore or on a Griffin, things like that. So running two, even though it is a bit overcosted, allows you to do some interesting things. Just really get around those flanks, become a nuisance. The other units are just there to kind of hold things up because you really want to be, getting those flank and rear charges. It's an interesting one, definitely a fun one. Go check out the full video. It's a little bit old now, but check that out if you're more interested in this one. So with all that said, let's answer the question, why should you play Abyssal Legion? I think you should play them if, as a kid, you had a pentagram sewn into your backpack. Your idea of a good time is getting windmilled while picking up change in a circle pit. If in game you want to cook with some lists, with some units that no one has ever seen ever.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
Stay tuned for next week, because we'll be taking a look at the pointy-eared. And until then, please like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff for the algorithm. Really helps out channels like this. Check out other PvP content creators in the description and the Discord server as well. And until next time, bye-bye.